Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Dread Time Stories. I'm your host, Dr. Phobia, and tonight, dear patients, our story comes from the world of Reddit No Sleep. So sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's tale. Never ever take your kids to Mount Rainier National Park. About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out of Tacoma to Mount Rainier, a place my dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son, David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy in the wilderness that I had. But I'm quite convinced that he would be terrified of forests for the rest of his life. When we arrived that Friday, the weather was crisp and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked, or rather I walked with David on my shoulders, for about 2, maybe 3 hours from the parking lot into a small, desolate campground with a pre-made fire pit. I'm not an overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around for a bit while I pitched the tent. Just as I was about done and was getting ready to unload our 3-day supply into the tent, I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now I recognize these sounds immediately, as they were sounds he usually makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and just saw him sitting in the grass, about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. More strangely, he was doing this thing that he does when he's particularly excited about something, in which he slaps both of his thighs repeatedly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the woods at the same time. But there was nothing in the tree line that I could make out. When I was finally by his side, I asked him what he had seen, and his response was, "Monkey man, monkey man." He was smiling, still slapping his thighs. And as much as I tried to match his excitement, like a good parent should do, suddenly the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I fixed my eyes on the tree line and peered very, very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked up David, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to frighten him. I mention this because the sensible thing might have been to hush him, or to tell him to keep quiet for a while. But then, I also knew realistically, this was just an imaginative manifestation. After a few minutes of scouting around with David on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I believe, so I made us some lunch and still kept an occasional eye on the space in which David had been clapping and yapping just a few moments before. As much as I tried to forget it, I just couldn't. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in aliens, ghosts, or Bigfoot. But I do suppose my parental instinct was simply just in too much of a high gear for me to let it go. So just as the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit about what he had seen. To understand my story a little better, it might have been relevant to mention here that David has a mild learning disability, in which he has some impaired speech. He can understand fine, but his ability to communicate is lagged behind somewhat. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked if it was a big monkey man. David thought about that for a second. Then he laughed and nodded. Then I asked if it seemed to be a nice monkey man, and David once again giggled in approval. Honestly, I really wasn't sure what else to ask. Nightfall struck, and on full bellies, I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out for David, and panic struck me hard. He wasn't in the tent anymore. With only my underwear on, I stormed out, but I realized it was too dark to see anything. So I dropped back into the tent and tore my flashlight out of my bag. I was screaming his name at the same time. With only the weak beam of my flashlight, I didn't think I would ever actually be able to rely on. I shone it all around in circles, still calling for David. For some reason, I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime, and shouted his name into the trees. As I trotted into the pitch-black woods, I was too frantic to notice how badly my feet were getting scraped by bark and stone. Only after a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop my flashlight and bolt forward. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, utterly still. I grabbed onto him so hard and began to sob. Still clutching him tightly, I picked up the flashlight again, which had been idly beaming the ground, and scouted around, fending off the darkness. I could see nothing. As I carried him back, looking over my shoulder, I asked what happened. He implied that he didn't know, and that he was tired. David has had a long history of sleepwalking. That night, I locked up the tent from the inside with the padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest, but David slept like a rock despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I cooked some bacon and eggs on the camping stove. David had no recollection of what had happened, and he seemed content to continue the trip. I thought it would be negligent to shove off last night's events as mere sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business, but also thought it'd be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over. Thus, I made a promise to myself that if anything else would happen, I would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice, and it helped me take my mind off of things. David was at first a little upset about not having the iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them and set them downstream, watched squirrels and listened to birds. It was everything I had hoped the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day in the tent. I brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with an electrode, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound. I don't remember what it's called, but David found it hilarious. It's dumb, but it supposedly helps with motor development. During one of David's turns, he made an error, and the little speaker made the sound again, and David bellowed into laughter. What happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything else would ever match. From about 150 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David made, only it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking and then digitally pitch it down. I froze, and this time, I couldn't hide my reaction from David. I could tell by his face that he had heard it too. I lifted a finger to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I noticed the sun had set completely. I also noticed how dead quiet the woods was. Every second felt like an eternity as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, enveloped in silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears ceased a little, I slowly leaned towards my backpack and got out my handgun. When I turned around to face David again, I saw he had picked up the electrode. I sternly removed it from his hands and whispered with equal sternness, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a low, broken voice whispered literally inches from the tent, "Not now, David." The next thing I know is I'm shooting wildly through the fabric of the tent in the direction of the sound. David is screaming as the gunshots ring through the woods. I hear the last remnants of something sprinting away. With my hand violently trembling, I open the padlock and jump out with my flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into black nothingness. I grab David, stuff everything within arm's reach into a backpack, and ran. The way back was pure terror. There was not a second at which I didn't feel like something was right behind us, ready to leap out from behind or the side of the trail, out from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David is, "It's okay. You'll get the iPad soon. Do you want the iPad? Nothing ever leaped out at us, nor did I ever hear anything except for the rushing of the wind and the occasional running stream by the trailside. I was so out of it that even in the car, I kept checking the back seat to see if there was something sitting in it, ready to kill us. I don't know how to explain to David's pediatrician what happened on Mount Rainier. I haven't even told his mother the full story. Only that someone came up to us at our tent and that I fired a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He's been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears by the gunshot. I really don't know how to end this story, but there is one thing for certain. Never, ever take your kids out to Mount Rainier. Well, dear patients, that was Never Ever Take Your Kids to Mount Rainier National Park. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening. Like I always say in closing, check under your bed, look in your closet, and sleep with the light on. The life you save may very well be your own. Good night, everyone.